Hey, what's up? It's Jake from Nimbus DevOps, and we're here to talk about Kubernetes namespaces. So first, let's kind of talk about what a Kubernetes namespace is. So I'm just going to touch this little example file, and we can use this to show you. Okay, so my name is Jake, and you know what? I'm not the only Jake in the world. There are a lot of other Jakes out there. If your name is Jake, hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel. So how do you differentiate between me and these other Jakes? Well, you might differentiate by last name, right? And you could have people with the same last name, and you might have people with different last names. So for this example, we'll go very simple, and we're just going to say that everybody has a different last name. Okay? So now, when we're out uh, riding bikes until the sun's going down and it's a nice summer day, and we see a mother come out to the porch. Uh-oh, here comes mom, right? And mom says to somebody, Jake, it's time to come home. Who is she talking to? Well, you'd need to know exactly who is out there. Now, if there was only one Jake, right? Then that Jake would go home. But if you have multiple Jakes, we have to go, well, whose mom is it? If it's mom dot last name 3, then she would be talking to this one. So if it was mom dot last name 4, then she'd be talking to this one. This is a pretty simple concept, but basically surnames are a lot like how namespaces work. So if you have ever been in a situation where you've needed to talk to somebody and say, hi, is Erlinda here? And they're like, Erlinda who? And you say, Erlinda Rodriguez. Then you'd say, oh, yeah, that one. We have two here. So in Kubernetes, you can isolate resources by namespace, kind of like giving them a secondary little label. So essentially, you could have a pod, right? Let's say you have an Nginx pod, and you have another Nginx pod, and one of them is for dev and one of them is for prod. How would you differentiate between the two? If you said kubectl apply for a deployment file, uh, how would you know that that manifest would apply to the dev or to the prod environment? Well, that depends on what namespace you run the imperative command. So in this case, we would say this one's going to be in the dev namespace and this one's going to be in the prod namespace. Then if I say something like kubectl apply -f, my nginx -pod.yaml file, and I want to say -- namespace equals dev, it's going to apply my declarative manifest file to this specific namespace, to the pod in this specific namespace. Okay, now if I ran this command like this, it would not touch production. So there's some automation you can do behind the scenes that if you scope it correctly and don't allow people to access it and have this run in a pipeline or something, then it's then there's no way that your dev runs will interfere with your prod runs. This is just one example. It's a very simple example, and you could do the same thing in prod down here by just changing this to prod. Now, if these are both in the dev and the prod namespaces, and I run the command kubectl apply -f nginx.pod, what do you think this is going to do? It's actually going to do nothing. And that's because if you did a kubectl get pods, essentially what you're doing is saying -- namespace equals default if you don't say anything. If nothing's running in the default namespace, it's not gonna find anything. So let's see what that looks like. I have a Jenkins pipeline running in my Kubernetes cluster right now. So you can see there's no pods in this namespace. So if I say kubectl, we'll just do this imperatively for now. Kubectl run, nginx dash dash image equals nginx. This is going to create an nginx pod in the default namespace. And if I do a get pods, we can see that there's one right here. And if I do a kubectl get all, we can see, actually here, let me do a wide, sorry. We can see here that this pod is running, let me get you the namespace. Let me describe it. Kubectl describe pod nginx. There we go. So you can see here that we're running in the default namespace. And just like I showed you above, you could also do kubectl get pods dash dash namespace equals default, and I get it. So if I delete this now, kubectl delete pod nginx, and we can see now that there's no pods in the default namespace. So let's now create a pod again. Let's run the nginx pod dash dash image equals nginx, and we'll say that namespace equals dev. What do you think is going to happen? Well, I didn't create a dev namespace, so it's probably going to tell me that there's no namespace, which it does. So we need to make one. So it's just like everything else, kubectl create namespace dev. And you can also abbreviate namespace with just ns. And now I have a namespace. And I can say kubectl get namespace. And we can see all the namespaces that I have. So now I have this dev namespace. So let's go ahead and create a prod one as well. And now I can say kubectl run nginx image equals nginx namespace equals dev, and it says it's created. And let's go ahead and create one name nginx2, and we'll put that one in prod. So kubectl get pods. There's no pods because it says it's in the default namespace. But if I do dash dash namespace equals dev, we expect to see my nginx one. If we do prod, it should show my nginx2, which it does. So this is a way, if you wanted to create a declarative file and you wanted to apply it, you could totally do that. So if I go over to, I think I have some stuff we can use. So here's a front-end pod definition file. I just copy this, and let's just make one real quick. Let's just make nginx test.yaml, and then I'll paste this in here and go, okay, I've got this nginx pod. All right, sweet. And it has, you see these, the image name and all that stuff. It matches my dev naming convention. So if I say kubectl apply dash f nginx test in the namespace of dev, you'll see this is a warning because I did not create it declaratively at the beginning. But if I do a kubectl get pods dash dash namespace equals dev, then we've got this running. And we now have all these updated resources. And I used some different CPU limits. And we can see that if we do a describe, just to confirm that this actually changed. So kubectl describe pod nginx in the namespace of dev. And there's all of my info. Everything looks good. So how would we do this in production? So if we did the same thing in prod, what do you think is going to happen? It's going to create a new one. Why? And that's because it doesn't match my naming convention. So if we do a kubectl get pods namespace equals prod, now we have two things running. So if I want to delete this and apply it to my existing nginx2, how would we do that? Now, ephemerally, you should be able to just delete and replace, right? No problem. In fact, you would create a deployment or replica set or something like that instead. But for the purpose of this, we will we'll do it this way. So I'm going to delete this nginx pod equals prod. And then now I should just have my nginx2. So if now I said I have this this pod, I want the nginx2 to be the name of the pod, and then I ran the same command, now what happens? It says, oh, I need the, yeah, nginx2 is invalid. Pod updates may not add or remove containers. So in this case, it needs to actually remove it, and it can't. So you'd probably have to do, like I said, a replica set or a deployment. Now, as far as, well, and also something you can do is in the metadata, you know how I keep having to say the namespace at the end? Well, you can actually put in here namespace dev. Ah, that's much better, huh? So now I can just be like, well, let me change the name again. Save that. kubectl apply -f, and I can just do the file, and it applies it automatically to the dev environment. Perfect. Perfect. That's exactly what I wanted. So you can declare that in here as well. There is a namespace file that you can use to create. So if you're trying to do your namespaces declaratively as well, that's something you can do. We'll just do a ns test file. And the way this looks is very similar to everything else. It has an API version, v1. The kind is obviously namespace. The capital N, sorry, namespace. And then you have metadata. Then there's other things you can do, but simply this is what it would be, the equivalent like that. So if I did a kubectl delete ns dev, it's going to delete my namespace. And you notice I had a pod in this namespace when I deleted it, right? So let's see what happens as soon as this is done. Boop. Kubectl get pods -- all namespaces. It's a neat trick to see everything. So we can see we have our nginx running in prod, but when we deleted our namespace, it deleted all the resources inside of it. So sometimes when you're doing testing, it's really convenient to just delete a namespace, and then you don't have to go through and clean up everything inside of it. It just deletes everything. So that's kind of fun. So let's go ahead and apply this and see what happens. So I have an nginx test manifest. I've got a namespace, and you'll notice that this requires a namespace. So this deployment file, or I should say this pod definition file, has a dependency on this namespace definition file. Well, Kubernetes is smart enough to know what to do. So if I say kubectl apply -f all the files in this directory, it'll say error creating this namespace dev not found. So if you try to make both of them at the same time, you got to be careful with what you do and when you do it, because order matters. So we can just do the same thing and say make my namespace, and it makes it, and it says make my nginx pod, and it makes it. And then if you wanted to list all your pods and all your namespaces, we can now see in the dev namespace that we have an nginx pod. So there you go. There's some logical separation. This will become very, very useful later, especially when we get more into the details. But for now, this should be good enough. So go ahead and create, delete namespaces, make pods in them. You'll see I have like my whole Jenkins system running in a DevOps tools namespace, so I can mess around like I'm doing right now, and it doesn't mess with my Jenkins stuff. So yeah, it's pretty handy. Let me know if you have any questions, and good luck.